Noemi is been a Brownfields project manager for many, many years. She worked on the mainland, she worked in Chicago. She's a very good partner to Region 9 and the cities and states there. So Noemi.
Sure, thanks, Ignacio. You can move to the next slide.
There you go.
So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, you've heard the examples of how US EPA funding can be spent, and I'm going to focus on how others on the call can figure out how to get some of this EPA funding and how you can also do some of the activities that others have talked about. So the Brownfields Act, which is called the BUILD Act, is the Brownfields Utilization Investment and Local Development Act. And so this was recently amended, giving even more flexibilities to US EPA in terms of its funding. We're going to have a request for proposals or request for applications that is going to come out sometime, we envision, around the middle or end of August. And in that request for applications, there are going to be 3 different grant types that you can apply for. You've heard about 2 of those spoken about today from both Hawai'i at Heart as well as City and County of Honolulu. And I'll talk about the 3rd type, which is a combination of both. So the first is a multi-purpose grant where you can get upwards of $800,000. It's to conduct both assessment and cleanup. Assessment grants, which is inherent in the name, it's to conduct environmental site assessments. You can get anywhere from $300,000 to $600,000. And then cleanup grants, which are used for remediation, and you can get up to $500,000. Next slide. So one of the things you're probably all thinking is, well, who is eligible to apply for this funding? So these are all the eligible entities. It's states, it's tribes, it's any general purpose or unit of local government. Nonprofits are eligible to apply for all the funding, and any qualified community development entity is also eligible to apply. We consider nonprofits to have the status of the 501c3 in order to be eligible for our funding. Next slide. And then I just wanted to give kind of the terminology for different terms that I'll use, and you've heard them used throughout the presentation today. So when I use environmental site assessments, I'm referring to that either being a phase 1 or a phase 2. So you heard from Heart Hawai'i, she talked a lot about the phase 1 environmental assessment. So when US EPA uses the term phase 1, it has to follow the ASTM standard, which is the all appropriate inquiry standard. So our funding can only be used following that standard. And then the phase 2, for those that are in Hawaii, you would follow whatever the standard is that the state would set for you, most likely, which would be incremental sampling. And if you're in the Pacific Islands, then you would follow what your Pacific Island counterparts would tell you. And so for cleanup planning, we'll talk a little bit about, we love to use acronyms. So the acronym APCA, which stands for the Analysis of Brownfields Cleanup Alternatives, we want to make sure that if we give you remediation funding, that you have done some analysis to determine what cleanup would be most appropriate for your site. And that's what we're referring to in terms of the APCA. And with site eligibility, I'll use that term quite a bit. We're not only looking at if the applicant is eligible for the funding, but also if the applicant, in order to ensure that the site is eligible, you cannot be liable for the contamination. And that is defined by EPA, because I have people tell me all the time, oh, no, I didn't cause the contamination. But sometimes just by clearly owning a site and the timing of owning the site could make you liable for the contamination. And just to clear up some myths about our funding, privately held sites, and I think Hawai'i talked about that as well as Tim, can use our EPA funding. It's not just for publicly held sites. And you heard distinguished a couple times in the presentation the difference between hazardous substance and petroleum. Our funding can be used on both, but we no longer require a split out in funding. When you apply to us for funding, it's all one color. It's no longer split between the 2 contaminants. Next slide.
So Noemi, in the best
Yes.
of your knowledge of the sites in Hawaii, what sites could you not use it on? For instance, for a military base.
Yep, so military base would not be eligible because it's owned by the federal government. So any site that is owned by the federal government is not eligible. any site that is under an enforcement order, some of the things that Ruby just talked about, if it's owned by an enforcement order, or if you have owned a site and you leased it to someone and that entity is the one that caused the contamination, then you're still liable for the contamination because you were the owner and you leased it out to the party that contaminated it while you owned it. So those are instances where the funding would not be available to you. So the first funding type that I'm going to talk about is the assessment grants. And both Hawai'i and TIM both have this type of funding. And this is probably our most popular funding type because this is the type of funding that will tell you to the extent that your site might be contaminated so you can get to cleanup and then eventually get to your redevelopment. You can also use this money to conduct cleanup planning. You can use it to do redevelopment planning, such as visioning with the community, architectural plans, transportation studies. The grant's for 3 years. If you apply for this grant with 2 other partners, so let's say it's a county unit and they apply with 2 other nonprofits, you can get up to $600,000. Or an entity can apply by itself for just 1 site and get a site-specific assessment, which is $350,000. Or you can apply and get what we call community-wide, which is what both TIM and Hawai'i have used. And then that means you can use the funding in whatever areas you designate. There is no match for this funding type. Next slide. When I talk about redevelopment planning, because in the past, our grants weren't really thought about as using them towards redevelopment planning. It was really focused on conducting environmental site assessments. And so I gave you a couple of examples before, but you can use it to do your site reuse plans, market evaluations, create site design, and you can also do it just to create renderings of what you want the development of an entire area to be, not just one particular site. And these type of redevelopment planning activities can be done under the assessment grant or the multi-purpose grant. Next slide. So cleanup grants, just kind of inherent in the name, the money is for conducting remediation. Again, you can also use it for reuse planning. You can use it for community engagement activities. A lot of times, state agencies, before you start your cleanup at a site, will require that you involve the local community. We require that as well as you receive this funding. You can use it to pay for any regulatory oversight fees that are associated with the remediation as well. With this grant, though, the entity that is applying for this funding must own the site, and we consider ownership to be fee simple title, but there are a few exceptions to that rule. For affordable housing developers, a lot of times they're tied up into ownerships and LLPs on a particular site. So in some instances, those sites, even though it's not fee simple, can be eligible to apply, but you'd have to talk to EPA first. This funding is up to $500,000. It's a 3-year grant, and it does require a 20% match, but the 20% match does not have to be hard cash. It can be done part of in-kind. Anything that is considered an eligible activity under the grant, you can also use that as a match. And so I'll say that for the $500,000 for the cleanup grant, the $500,000 does not have to be spent at one site. If you have 2 sites that need cleanup, but they're each about 200 or 250,000, you can apply for the 500,000 for 2 sites. It doesn't have to just be 1 site. Next slide. So the last one is our multi-purpose grant. This is a newer grant for us, and this is where we combine both assessment and cleanup into one grant. And so this gives you the opportunity to get $800,000. The site that you conduct the assessment on does not have to be the site that you're going to clean up. They can be various sites. You can conduct assessments at 4 sites and cleanups at 1 site, or cleanup at 2 sites and assessment at 1. You decide. The funding is for you to decide. The only thing for the cleanup grant is that the applicant must own the site for the cleanup. And if you get the $800,000 and you realize, I don't really have a site that's eligible, I don't have anything to clean up, I think I'll just use the $800,000 for all of assessment. That's actually not allowed. So $200,000 at a minimum has to be set aside for cleanup. And if you're not able to conduct that, then EPA will pull that $200,000 back, and the remainder could be spent for assessment. It's a 5-year grant. It also has a 20% match, but the 20% match can be off of both assessment or cleanup activities. We do require that you have in your application to us that you've considered an overall plan for revitalization in your community. And also, if you plan to apply for the multi-purpose grant, you cannot apply for an individual assessment or cleanup grant. Next slide. So the other thing with the cleanup grant is that we do require that 70% of the $800,000 must be for site-specific work. So we're not looking for this grant to be mainly spent on cleanup planning or redevelopment planning. And typically we'll have within our guidelines an opportunity to apply for cost share waivers for the 20%. But typically on this grant type, we do not allow for cost share waivers. It likely will not be accepted this year. Next slide. So again, this is just kind of a summary of the funding, the request for applications that will come out shortly. Again, you cannot submit both an assessment and cleanup application if you are planning to apply for a multi-purpose grant. However, if you want to apply for assessment and cleanup separately, you can apply for both. If you are a current EPA assessment grantee, which both Hawai'i and TIM are, they would not be eligible to apply for more funding unless they've expended 70% of the funds before they can apply for more funding from us. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about this grant type. The request for applications is actually open right now. And it's much different than any other grants that I talked about. This is actually workforce development. And so it's for you to train and place individuals within your community in environmental jobs and careers. And so the different types of training is really based on what your market analysis would tell you within your community, like what jobs are available now, and then that's the kind of training you would give them. So different types of training that we've seen applicants or grantees implement would be lead and asbestos training. The 40-hour house walker training is a required training. That's the only training that we say that you have to implement. There's various types of OSHA health and safety training, renewable energy training, and a lot of that will be partnered with unions or other partners in terms of getting electrician training, wastewater treatment training. It's a $200,000 grant. It's a super competitive grant. We only award about 20 to 22 of these across the nation annually. The term on this grant is 3 years. Next slide. And so this is just a couple of pictures of graduates going through the job training program at different entities. Next slide. And so this just show you, because we have a lot of training in our region for renewable energy. And so we have awarded several of these grants to Nye County in Nevada and across California and Richmond and Los Angeles, where they've done a lot of renewable energy training and put folks to work. And Marine Clean Energy in the Bay Area just hired about 20 different individuals from the job training program in Richmond. And so it's just a couple of slides depicting that, since I know renewable energy is kind of a topic in Hawaii right now. Next slide. So this, I wanted to talk a little bit about our targeted brownfields assessment program. So this is not funding that you can apply for directly. It's a service that we would provide to you. So the project that Miriam talked about earlier, this is where she came to US EPA for assistance. We didn't give EH Housing any funding directly, but we gave them this assistance through contractors that we already have on retainer. It's a much easier application. It's only 2 pages. You can apply online. It's about $100,000 value. You can do phase 1, phase 2, APCA. It'll help you get closer to your development. We're really looking for, since it's a first come, first served basis, we're looking for projects that not only serve the public good, but can reiterate to us that development is happening. And so EH Housing was a good example. As soon as we finished our work with them, they were able to move into remediation and get their project built. Next slide. And so this is, the next few slides are just a couple of pictures to illustrate different projects that we funded in the past. We do mixed use development. And so just remember that our funding does not fund the actual reuse or revitalization in your community. It sets the stage and it takes care of the environmental work that's needed before you can start the cleanup. Next slide. So another example in San Francisco. So it can be used for mixed use. It can be used for open space. Next slide. So along the Los Angeles River, within LA, it's about a 50-mile stretch. There's about 32 miles that are located within the city of Los Angeles, and they're doing a huge revitalization of the river. And we have funded millions towards that project. We've given them over $1 million in cleanup funding and close to $800,000 in assessment money for various projects along the LA River. Next slide. So you can see kind of what Miriam talked about, what's been done with her project. Affordable housing is obviously a hot topic across California as well. So we funded a lot of projects. This is in Sacramento, California. Next slide. And then also kind of being what Tim talked about, transit-oriented development. So they were updating the trolley in San Diego, California, and they built an affordable housing project of about 52 units that are right along the rail site there. Next slide. And then lastly, just wanted to advertise as US EPA. We have an annual conference that we put on every 18 months. We just held one in December in Los Angeles, and the next one will be in Oklahoma City. We hope we'll be able to host it in April of next year, and that's our plan. And so that's another great way for you to receive a lot of information about brownfields. Next slide. Just lastly, want to plug for Center for Creative Land Recycling, as Ignacio said. They're a grantee to EPA and provide a lot of technical assistance. So definitely reach out to them for more information on brownfields. And then last slide is my contact information. So if you have any questions, you can email or call me directly.
Yes, Noemi, actually, to bring up your your previous slide, we always get questions from community members, and sometimes they're county people or they're just helping the community about sites that need assessment, but they don't know where to get funds. And of course, we refer them to your targeted brownfield assessment, but if I were a county and let's say Kauai County, and there are many sites there that I would like assessed, but I do not own them, what would I need to do to apply for an assessment grant?
But you do not own the sites.
Yes.
Well, if it's the county asking, the county would have to get the owner's permission before they could go on the site and conduct the assessment. So one of the things I should have said off the bat, which I think Savan did a really good job, is we provide funding, but we are not the regulators when it comes to brownfields. Even though US EPA money is being used, you do not follow EPA's guidelines. You're following the Hawaii Department of Health. So you would be collaborating with Melody, Savan, and others on the staff to find out what needs to be done at a site. There's no regulatory powers that EPA has that we would help you to get on a property to conduct an assessment. The only way we would do that, which would not come through brownfields, it would come through our emergency response. And obviously we're going to respond to any emergencies that are imminent to human health and the environment. But I would say if you want to sample on sites that you do not own but are in need of help, then talk to those owners. And we can, I mean, given what Savan said earlier, we can also assure property owners that we would not pursue or use our regulatory powers to come after them based on any information that was found, unless it was imminent to human health and the environment, but that's highly unlikely.
Thank you. And now what we're going to do